Okay, get your pens and your highlighters ready and let's check out how to approach paper 1 question 4. The first thing you need to do is underline which part of the text you're answering the question from. Believe it or not, many students answer from the wrong part. Then you want to go to the actual text and mark it on there so that you simply can't make a mistake. So there you go, I know that I'm starting at line 34. Now I'm going to go through the question and work out what it is the examiner's after. Now normally the question's divided into 2 parts and I'll show you those 2 parts here. Number 1, how cruel Hartop is, that's Alice's father, and number 2, how much sympathy we have with Alice. As I say, question 4 will always be in 2 parts. Next, you'll see me reminding myself that I've got to use the word however in my answer. And the easiest way to do that is to force myself to write a partial disagreement with the question. So you'll see me in my answer use however quite frequently, and that's because the second bullet point always begins with the word evaluate. Evaluate's also in the mark scheme, so this is the only way I can see that you will safely show the examiner you're evaluating. You're basically saying, yeah, I mostly agree, but however this. Every time you use that word however, you're evaluating, and consequently the examiner has to see that you've answered the question fully. Now the other thing that the mark scheme really likes is an overall summary, like a sentence at the beginning that summarises your view about the text. Now that's why I'm writing here, leave 2 lines to put in your opening statement, which will be a summary. Why not do it at the start? Well, because at the start I might not know what my summary is. I'm only going to work that out when I answer the whole question. The final bit I'm making a note on here is that could is the wrong word. It is must. I have to include those 2 bullet points in order to have a chance of getting a top grade. Now I'm going to write down my acronym VASE, V-A-S-E. These are the 4 things I'm going to focus on. Now the reason I've done that is I could comment about absolutely anything, and dozens of things could turn up in any exam paper, but VASE helps me work out what are the precise things that will turn up. And so I know V stands for the verbs that the writer uses, A stands for alliteration, and I've added into that sibilance because it's a type of alliteration. Then S stands for simile, but actually I'm going to link all those figurative use of language together, so metaphor and personification go with simile. And then finally, every writer thinks about emotive language. So I know that if I write about those 4 things, verbs, alliteration, simile, emotive language, and the ones listed by it, I will get top marks. But even better than that, I know that every single text that I come across in any exam will have those 4 things in them, so I'll always be able to get top marks focusing on them. Now at the top of my extract, or the part that I'm looking at, I'm going to write down the things that I have to focus on in the question so that I can't possibly get this wrong. So this is the cruelty of Hartop and the sympathy for Alice. Now I've anchored my thinking, and every time I can find something relevant to that, I'm going to highlight it in yellow in the passage. So he shouted at her, which also shows that he's cruel to her. He's also leaned across his wife to do it, which suggests that perhaps his cruelty is caused by a dislike of women. Next, she, the mother, is protesting, which suggests that she definitely thinks that Hartop's being cruel. He tells her you'll catch up, which shows at least indifference, and given the weather that we're going to uncover, it's also cruel. Next we find out that the car moves away from her very rapidly, giving us this feeling of abandonment. When we read the description of the rain, we can see it smashes her full in the face due to the force of the wind. These descriptions obviously make us feel sympathetic, but then we look at how she reacts without hurrying and we realise that maybe she doesn't need our sympathy. She seems to accept what's going on, and in fact that word is repeated to emphasize that his cruelty doesn't really matter. She reacts quite stoically. Now you might not know what that means, so I'm going to leave that out of my answer. Okay, now I've spotted a simile as though she had a long journey before her, and I sense that this is being used in a metaphorical sense. It's symbolic, as is the next phrase, that she could see nothing. So I could use that to show that she deserves our sympathy, or to argue that she's got plans of escape, and that's what this metaphorical writing's all about. Next, I notice that she stumbled, which I can use to show that we're getting sympathetic towards her, and I've suddenly remembered, oh yes, I'm supposed to be focusing on verbs. Then I've got a symbolic use of the red tail light here, which often suggests danger symbolically, so I might write about that. And we've got the idea of the rain being recurrent, got some alliteration going on, and that's also a metaphor, isn't it, where her lashes transforming the lights of the houses into sudden stars. So I know, as it's a metaphor, I've got to write about that. It feels like a hopeful image, so I'm probably going to link that to a however. In other words, that diminishes our sympathy because she appears happy about this, or at least her experience appears better. Now I notice that the verbs become urgent, the repetition of go, 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 and that conveys again his cruelty, which is emphasised by move yourself. Then Alice obeyed at once, which shows that she feels oppressed. Next, I notice the use of this word vanished, which suggests that she's being erased by her father's cruelty, and she's even been robbed of a voice. She goes away without speaking a word, so it feels like her identity has been attacked by her father. Now, in the real exam, I'm not going to annotate for quite so many things, and here I'm going to be selective in the ones that I use. I'm going to select them by using VASE, because that's going to frame my answer. So here I go, remembering to keep the first two lines free. Notice how I say Alice's father seems to be dismissive, because this tentative language allows me to be evaluative. I'm also integrating my quotations and referring to the reader as we. I now go back to tick off the quotations that I've already used and find the next couple I'm going to write about. The first bullet point was about cruelty, so I'm making sure to use that keyword in both of my first paragraphs. Again, I'm embedding single word quotations, which is simply more expert, and notice the word however is introducing the evaluation again. Now I check back for the next couple of quotations to use. Once again, I'm focusing on the keyword of cruelty at the beginning. I'm introducing the reader as we, and I'm getting stuck into VASE now. Verbs is where I'm going to start. Now, if I come across another technique such as repetition, I'm going to name it. I'm not going to worry that it's not in VASE, but I'm only specifically looking for VASE because I know that will come up in every single question. Now I go back to plan my next paragraph by looking at the extract and my notes again. Now I notice that the verbs are being used in an emotive way, so I'm also going to call this emotive language because, of course, that's in VASE. Notice how I'm using tentative language like perhaps, might, possibly and probably. These words all show the examiner that I am evaluating, so they have to give me a top grade. Now, I don't have to write about every single incidence of cruelty. I've just picked out the main ones, and I'm now ready to move on to the second bullet point of sympathy. But notice that I link the two together. I'm saying, because of the cruelty, we now have sympathy, and that makes my answer more sophisticated. But I'm also aware I've not been following through on all the parts of VASE. I haven't written about any alliteration yet, so I go back to the passage to find some. So immediately I find the fricative alliteration of full in the face. That's quite violent sounding. And then I've got some sibilance with seamed and smashed. And then I spot a second example of sibilance, which I know other students won't get, so I'm going to focus on that if I can, of seemed to accept. Notice the double C in accept is still sibilance. So can I write about them? Sibilance is always used for the same two uses, either to make something sinister or conversely to make it peaceful. I will decide which it is as I write my answer. And I highlighted that whole metaphor, so it's about time I wrote about that, because that's the other part of VASE that I need to include to get the top grades. Notice that there is a high probability the alliteration that you find in any passage will contain the letter F, because it's always aggressive and that always fits the kinds of text that examiners ask us about. Always name the technique if you can, but if you can't, the ones that are in VASE, in other words just calling it alliteration, is fine. But if you know it's fricative, even better. I'm starting this paragraph with however, again being evaluative. I'm using the word sympathy to show the examiner that I'm answering the question all the way through. I now have a new technique, sibilance, which is also part of VASE, and I'm using tentative language with appear and as though. So I'm working my way through VASE, and I'm also linking the idea of cruelty to the idea of sympathy. So it's back to VASE, and I'm going to look at metaphor, and again tentative language with as though and perhaps. And I haven't mentioned embedded quotations in a while. Notice that you can have longer quotations skillfully embedded in your sentences too. Paragraph finished. Now let's go back and check what the next points are going to be for the next paragraph. There are two new things that I want you to notice here. Always write about the ending of the text, because that shows you've got a complete understanding of the whole thing. And I keep using the word emphasised to show the writer at work, to show this is a deliberate effect. Now it's worth remembering that any text you get in the exam will be from a larger text, and the examiner will tell you whether it's a novel or a story or whatever. So it's worth making a point about how this particular bit of writing helps you predict what might happen later in the text. There are three things to notice here: the tentative language with might, the repetition of however to show I'm evaluating, and the continual reference back to cruelty even though I'm writing about sympathy now. Linking those two bullet points together shows my answer has a really developed structure. Now I may well have done enough evaluation to get full marks, but I'm taking no chances. I'm going to use my whole time limit, and I'm going back to VASE. What haven't I written about yet? This metaphor, the idea that the rain is being turned into stars. That's an image of hope, isn't it? Okay, let's put that into my answer. So this is your opportunity to look for techniques that we've already studied in this video to see if I'm using them again and you're spotting them. It's also worth pointing out that every time you write about a metaphor, you're doing something that most students will miss. And it's the same with sibilance. Just as in creative writing, students forget about using metaphors, using similes instead, and forget about sibilance, using alliteration instead. It's just such an easy way to get higher marks because you're so different from the other candidates in the exam room. Okay, it's an exam, so I'm going to go back and look at the things I wanted to put in. Remember that plan I did analysing the question at the beginning, and I'm going to check that I've got all those things in. Yes, I've included both bullet points. I've used however. I've got a partial disagreement, but look, I've still got to do those 2 lines at the beginning which give a summary statement, because that's what the mark scheme does. So I want to write about the author's purpose, and I want to link the 2 bullet points together, in this case cruelty and sympathy. Right, that's completed my answer, but what have you learned? Time to test yourself. What have you learned about how many parts there are to the question? What sort of language you should use? Which words will force you to evaluate all the time? How do you treat the second bullet point to let the examiner know you're linking it to the first bullet point? How many paragraphs should you write at one time? What are the different elements of VASE? And how did I make sure I'd got them all in? How do you make sure you're answering from the right part of the text? If you're unsure of any of these answers, go and increase my watch time by going back to earlier parts of the video. And if you would like to learn more about the language exam, check out one of the videos appearing on the left or the right. Or if you catch any of them relieving themselves, my apologies, I'm getting old.